William Lane Craig has some helpful videos, short videos explaining his moral argument for God's existence. And we're going to watch about a 1 minute clip from one of these videos that was posted on his Reasonable Faith Updates Twitter feed. And then we're going to debrief the clip on the other side. So let's take a look.
The question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object.
So we can get the gist of the argument there. Craig is saying that we need God as the objective standard of moral value and obligation, because if we don't have God, then the only standard available is that of the subjective individual's reference point. So my first quick response is that this video makes quick reference to objective moral values and obligations, and those are two different things. So one could have an argument, for example, that one needs God for objective moral obligations, but not objective moral value. Objective moral value is good and evil. Objective moral obligations are right and wrong, or what you ought to do and ought not to do. And one could argue, for example, that moral value exists apart from God, but only moral obligations, objective moral obligations, are somehow rooted in the divine nature, or God issuing to us obligations about how we ought to live with respect to the objective moral good. So essentially, it's good just to keep these things distinct in our minds. The second thing that I would want to point out is that the argument presented here is that if there is no objective reference point to determine what is good, then all we are left with is the subjective preference of the individual perceiver. So that's how the video ends, with saying all that we are left with is each person saying, just as, I like the taste of ice cream, so I like this, and that's all that you have for subjective morality. And it's worth pointing out that that doesn't obviously follow. There could be various types of subjective morality. So, for example, you could have some kind of social construction view of morality, just as money has value through social construction, and it is enormous. Money has enormous power on a social construction view. How it is constructed as valuable relative to social groupings. So you could argue that morality is subjectively created, but still has some sort of objective reference point with respect to societies that construct those moral values. You could also argue, perhaps, that moral value arises with respect to species in some way, that it is a human species that determines moral value for that species. These are, in principle at least, different subjective accounts that don't collapse into the radical individualism of moral value being determined by a single person, as is implied by Craig's view, that either you have subjective morality only with respect to the one individual, or you have objective morality. There could be types of subjective morality that are not radically individualistic and atomistic, as Craig's argument presumes. But the last thing and the most important thing that I want to say about the argument, and what I think is, in some respects, its Achilles heel, is that the argument assumes, again, you need God to have an objective reference point beyond the human individual or beyond nature. And that doesn't follow. For example, a person could be a moral Platonist. They could believe there's an objective universal good, and that objective universal good can be exemplified in the concrete actions of moral agents in states of affairs and actions in space-time. So if you do an action that embodies the good or exemplifies the good, that would be similar to a fire truck exemplifying the color of redness in space-time. So your moral action could exemplify objective goodness in space-time, in each case because of the universal red or because of the universal good. And all that you would need as an atheist is to posit that there's an objective, transcendent, universal good. It is true that that position would be inconsistent with standard conceptions of naturalism, which says that all that exists is nature, or what is described by a hypothetically completed natural science, or something like that. But that is um, just means you have to reject naturalism to have objective moral good. It doesn't mean you have to reject atheism. You could be an atheist and believe, for example, in a Platonic transcendent good. Now, the theist could argue at this point that if you affirm a transcendent universal good, then that is God. So you've fallen into theism, perhaps unawares. But to argue that, you'd have to insist that simply arguing for something transcendent from nature is sufficient to qualify one as a theist. And what that's a view that many people would just reject. Many people would think that to be a theist, one must believe that the transcendent metaphysical entity that one posits has some sort of mental properties, conscious life, the ability to act with agency and with intent, something analogous to human persons. And that is not the Platonic universal. The Platonic universal of objective goodness would not be something that has moral agency itself can or a sort of agency at all. It can't act. It doesn't have conscious life. It doesn't have intentions. It is just a brute fact that it exists as an object of moral good, which can be exemplified in the actions of finite moral agent creatures. So the theist who argues the atheist moral Platonist collapses into theism is really trying to force them to accept a view of theism as encompassing moral Platonism, which just many people do not accept that. So at best, that would be winning the argument by definitional fiat, which I don't think is a very satisfactory response. The one response that a theist could argue here, I think would be legitimate, is to say that okay, you could have goodness without God by positing an abstract moral universal form of the good, and that isn't theism. They could concede all that, but still say, nonetheless, you've moved a step closer to theism. You've moved away from naturalism and closer to theism by positing some objective, abstract universal that transcends nature and is the form of the good. You could argue that, and look rather than to this as building a bridge to theism rather than entailing theism as a conclusion. And that, to my mind, is the most satisfactory and the most promising way to appropriate the kind of argument that Craig is presenting here. I don't think that he shows to conclude that one must be a theist in order to have objective moral good, but accepting an objective account of moral good that transcends the universe does arguably bring a person one step closer to the metaphysics of theism.